I pulled into my driveway after a 2-week business trip, exhausted and ready for nothing more than the comfort of home. But the moment I stepped out of my car, something felt deeply off. The porch lights, which usually greeted me like old friends, were erratically flickering, as if they too were uneasy about the silence that had taken over. I paused on the sidewalk, heart suddenly thumping harder in my chest, wondering if I'd somehow missed a message or a call warning me of an issue. The house, usually alive with the soft hum of evening routines, was eerily quiet. Normally, I'd hear the comforting sounds of my 8-year-old daughter Sophie settling down in front of the TV, her gentle hums or occasional giggles filling the space with warmth. Tonight, there was nothing. The darkness that enveloped the interior through the windows wasn't the peaceful kind that comes with bedtime. It was heavy, almost suffocating. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized that the familiar comfort of my home was now replaced by an unsettling silence. Every instinct screamed at me to hurry inside. Yet I paused for a moment at the threshold, grappling with a mix of exhaustion and a deep-seated anxiety that I couldn't quite explain. As I pushed open the door, the creak of the old hinge sounded like a whisper of warning. The air inside felt different, stale and oddly still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I flicked on the light, half expecting to see Sophie curled up on the couch, her favorite blanket draped around her shoulders, and maybe even her favorite stuffed animal clutched in her arms. Instead, the living room lay in a disconcerting dimness, the television silent and dark. My mind raced with 1,000 anxious thoughts. Had something happened while I was away? Was there a power outage? Or worse, had someone been in our home? The feeling of unease gnawed at me as I moved cautiously through the hallway. Every step felt amplified in the silence, the creaks of the wooden floorboards echoing like distant footsteps. I called out softly for Sophie, my voice sounding more desperate than I had intended. There was no response. The deeper I ventured into the house, the more I realized that every familiar corner and shadow now felt alien and ominous. I paused in the doorway of her room. It was empty. The bed was neatly made, a small, almost heartbreaking reminder that I was not the only one whose routine had been disrupted. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to process what was happening. In that moment, every instinct told me that something was terribly wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a scene that had been set long before my return, as if the house had been waiting for me, ready to reveal a secret I wasn't prepared for. I couldn't help but wonder, had I missed some vital communication, some emergency notice? But there was no hint of any explanation, just the profound silence and the unsettling flicker of the porch light outside. In that unnerving stillness, I felt an overwhelming need to understand what was happening. I moved from room to room, searching for any clue, any sign of disturbance or mischief, all while my mind raced with worry for Sophie. The contrast between the usual coziness of our home and this palpable tension was jarring. Everything that should have been normal was not. Every corner held the potential for unexpected danger, and every sound, or lack thereof, seemed loaded with ominous significance. I was no longer just returning from a business trip. I was stepping into an unknown chapter of a story I never thought I'd be part of, a story that, somehow, had already begun without me. In that moment, as I stood alone in the silence of our once vibrant home, a deep premonition of trouble settled in my gut. I knew that the events of tonight were only the beginning, and that the comfort and safety I'd taken for granted were now under threat. And as fear and determination warred within me, I realized that the journey ahead would force me to confront not just the mystery of what happened here, but also the hidden secrets of our own lives that I had long ignored. I took a deep, shaky breath and started retracing my steps through the house, trying to make sense of the growing nightmare. The silence was suffocating, a stark contrast to the familiar hum of evening activity I had once taken for granted. I entered the kitchen, half expecting to find evidence of a hurried dinner, or even the remnants of a meal hastily abandoned. Instead, I found a void. The table was set as if dinner had been planned, but there was no sign of food, no lingering aroma, and the light above the sink, which I always left on after washing up, remained off. The eerie stillness pressed in on me, intensifying the dread that something was horribly amiss. My mind raced as I made my way upstairs. Every creak of the stairs a deafening reminder of the unnatural quiet that had swallowed our home. When I reached Sophie's room, I felt my stomach drop further. Her bed was empty. The neatly arranged covers and her favorite stuffed bear sitting in the corner were all that remained, a stark, heart-wrenching sign that she wasn't there. Panic surged through me as I pounded on her door, calling her name over and over, my voice echoing in the silent hallway. It was as if the house itself had swallowed her whole. Desperate for answers, I hurried to Melanie's room next. I opened her closet, hoping to find some clue about where she might have gone or what could have happened. Instead, I was met with disarray. Her closet was in utter chaos, and several items were missing. Among them was her favorite coat, a luxurious, well-loved garment, and her expensive $2,000 bag, which she had always cherished. It was as if someone had ransacked her personal space, taking only the things that held sentimental or financial value. The violation of our personal sanctuary made my skin crawl, adding another layer of terror to the situation. I fumbled with my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed Melanie's number, praying for some sign that she was safe. But the line went straight to voicemail, each ring echoing my rising panic. The silence on the other end was as unnerving as the silence in our home. With each unanswered call, the dread deepened. I couldn't bear the thought that she might be in danger too. Just as I was about to redial, my phone rang with an unknown number flashing on the screen. Hesitant, I answered with a mixture of hope and dread. The voice on the line was calm, but carried an undertone of urgency. "Mr. Baker, this is Dr. Collins from the emergency room," the caller said. My heart skipped a beat. "Your daughter, Sophie, was found unconscious at your home. We've already taken her here for evaluation and stabilization." The words crashed over me like a tidal wave. My mind raced to connect the dots. How could she have been found here, in our home, and why hadn't I seen any signs of her distress? I demanded more information, my voice quivering with barely contained terror. Dr. Collins explained that a neighbor, hearing a faint cry, had noticed something was wrong. They found Sophie in her bedroom, seemingly unresponsive, with a strange bruise on her arm that hadn't been there before. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, but the medical team was still trying to piece together the events leading up to her collapse. I felt a surge of guilt, mixed with a deep, gnawing fear. How could I have been so oblivious? I racked my brain, trying to recall any sign that I might have missed, any hint that Sophie was in danger, but the answer eluded me. The horrifying possibility crept in. Something or someone had been in our home, leaving behind chaos and taking away the ones I loved most. My thoughts spiraled into a jumble of confusion and despair, the reality of the situation too much to bear. As I stood there in the darkened hallway, clutching my phone and listening to the distant beeps of hospital machinery over the phone line, I couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of a twisted nightmare. Every detail, every missing item, every unanswered call pointed to a deliberate intrusion into our lives. The house that once stood as a symbol of safety and routine had become a stage for a mystery that threatened to unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. In that moment of terror and uncertainty, I vowed to do whatever it took to find the truth about Sophie, about Melanie, and about the dark presence that had invaded our sanctuary. The questions multiplied in my mind. Who could be behind this? Was it a random act, or was it something far more sinister? And most chilling of all, what did they want? The silence around me offered no answers, only deepening the mystery and intensifying the dread that gnawed at my every thought. As the call ended, leaving me with nothing but a silent, cold line and a heart full of unanswered questions, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer a passive bystander in my own life. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever before. I was determined to uncover every secret hidden within the walls of our once safe home, no matter the cost, even if it meant delving into a darkness that I had never imagined existed. I threw my car into overdrive, the dashboard lights blurring as I pushed the accelerator harder than ever before. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat a desperate reminder that every second counted. I was barreling down the highway at 150 kilometers per hour, an insane speed I never imagined I'd risk. My mind a chaotic blend of terror, anger, and disbelief. The flashing streetlights smeared into streaks of light around me, and I barely registered the near miss with a car that swerved out of my path. In that heart-stopping moment, I was driven solely by the need to reach the hospital, to see my daughter, and to understand the nightmare unfolding around me. The blur of the road eventually gave way to the stark reality of the hospital entrance, where frantic voices and hurried steps matched the rhythm of my own racing thoughts. I burst through the doors and demanded to see the doctor who was handling Sophie's case, my voice trembling with a mix of hope and barely contained rage. The doctor, a tired yet determined woman with kind eyes, met me in the small, waiting area. As she explained the situation, the details felt like shards of ice plunging into my chest. "Sophie is in critical condition," she said softly, her tone clinical, yet laced with genuine concern. "She's severely dehydrated, her body temperature soared to 40 degrees Celsius, and her blood sugar level is critically low. Honestly, if it wasn't for the neighbor calling an ambulance, she might not be here today." Each word landed with brutal clarity, and I found myself struggling to process the gravity of it all. My daughter, the light of my life, had nearly slipped away from me because of neglect that stemmed from someone I trusted the most. Every explanation I sought only deepened the wound. The doctor's measured words contrasted starkly with the chaotic emotions swirling within me. I tried to piece together the puzzle, my mind replaying the moments of our earlier conversation, the eerie silence in the house, the missing pieces of our lives that suddenly made no sense. But no matter how hard I tried, the most painful truth was unavoidable. Melanie was missing. Not just absent for a few hours or a day. She had been gone for almost 2 days. And now, I was forced to confront the reality that she had left Sophie alone, abandoning her in the very home that was supposed to be a sanctuary. The weight of betrayal hit me like a freight train. My wife, my partner, the person I believed was always there, had simply walked out, leaving our daughter to fend for herself. In my mind, I could picture her hurrying out of the house without a backward glance, as if the chaos unfolding around us was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The thought was almost too much to bear, twisting my stomach into knots. How could someone so integral to our family vanish so casually, leaving behind such devastating consequences? My anger surged as I demanded more details from the doctor, who continued to explain in a measured, sorrowful tone how Sophie's condition was a direct result of prolonged neglect. The critical low blood sugar, the searing fever, the alarming dehydration, all were symptoms of a child left without the care she so desperately needed. I found myself gripping the arms of the chair, the sterile hospital room suddenly feeling claustrophobic and hostile. Every beep of the monitor was a grim reminder of how close we had come to losing her forever. In that sterile, antiseptic room, as I listened to the faint hum of medical equipment and the soft murmur of the hospital staff, I was overwhelmed by a cocktail of emotions. There was a burning need for answers, an unyielding desire to understand how everything had spiraled so disastrously out of control. My mind whirled with questions that seemed to have no answers. Where had Melanie gone? What had prompted her to leave? And most importantly, how had I missed the signs that something was terribly wrong in our home? The urgency of the situation forced me to confront the painful truth head-on. Melanie's absence wasn't a brief lapse or a momentary mistake. It was a deliberate act of abandonment. The fact that she'd been gone for nearly 2 days, leaving a child in critical condition, was a betrayal of the deepest order. In that moment, as I sat beside Sophie's bed, watching her struggle to fight for life, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The foundations of my world had been shattered, and the fragments of our once safe life lay scattered around me. With each passing minute, I vowed to do everything in my power to make sure Sophie would recover, and to confront the truth behind Melanie's disappearance. The pain was searing, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. I was no longer just a passive victim of circumstance. The shock, the betrayal, and the desperate need for answers were the sparks that ignited a fierce determination within me. I would uncover every hidden detail, every dark secret that led to this catastrophic moment, no matter how painful or dangerous the journey might be. As I left the hospital room with a mix of dread and resolve burning inside me, I knew that I was about to embark on a path from which there might be no return. The terrible truth had been laid bare, and it was now up to me to confront the chaos and restore some semblance of order in our shattered lives. My phone buzzed unexpectedly, and for a moment I hesitated before answering. When I picked up, Melanie's voice flowed through the line in a light, almost carefree tone, as if nothing had happened. But I caught something in the background, a male voice, low and unmistakable, casually interjecting as if it belonged. My blood ran cold. It was a detail that shattered any remnants of the pretense she was trying to maintain. I pressed her for details, but her responses were evasive, filled with an unsettling nonchalance that made my stomach churn. In that instant, memories of her habitual getaways came rushing back. Those times when she claimed she was going to rest at that rundown motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the first time I'd seen a pattern, but now it carried a sinister weight. The phone call had confirmed my worst suspicions. She was lying. I couldn't sit still any longer, not with the evidence of betrayal whispering at the edges of my sanity. Without wasting another second, I jumped into my car and sped off toward the motel. Every red light blurred into streaks of color as I pushed the accelerator, my mind a whirlwind of fury and disbelief. When I finally arrived, I noticed her car parked haphazardly near the entrance, its presence a grim marker of where to begin my search for the truth. I parked at a discreet distance and activated the video recording on my phone. The cool night air did little to calm the inferno of emotions burning inside me as I circled the building. The motel was nothing glamorous, a shabby structure with peeling paint and flickering neon signs that offered little promise of honesty. It was here that I hoped to finally confront the betrayal that had upended my life. Peering through a grimy window on the ground floor, I was met with a scene I could scarcely believe. There, in a room that looked as tired as the building itself, was Melanie. She was dressed in a cheap, worn bathrobe that hung loosely around her, and she was sitting on the unmade bed with another man. Their posture and quiet conversation left no room for doubt. They were together, completely at ease, as if her shattered lives were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in their world. Every detail, the way she absent-mindedly played with the hem of her robe, the subtle intimacy in the man's gestures, spoke volumes of the betrayal I had been dreading. I recorded everything, my hands trembling as the video captured her nonchalant demeanor and the man's relaxed presence. Each second of footage seared the truth into my memory. The surreal calm with which she carried herself now clashed violently with the reality of her deceit. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a cold abandonment of the promises we'd made, a violation of the trust that had once bound us together. Determination solidified within me as I stepped away from the window. I had evidence, undeniable and raw, and now it was time to confront her face to face. I strode up to the door, every step echoing my resolve, and rapped sharply on it. The knock reverberated down the silent corridor inside, a stark announcement of my arrival that could no longer be ignored. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing Melanie's startled face. Her eyes widened in a mix of guilt and panic as they met mine, and for a fleeting second, I saw the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. I held her gaze, the weight of the video evidence heavy on my mind, and said, "We need to talk now." Her attempt at a smile faltered, and I could almost hear the internal scramble for excuses as she tried to muster a calm explanation. But in that charged silence, every unsaid word and every regretful glance spoke louder than any feeble justification. The quiet room seemed to close in on us, filled with the unspoken admission of betrayal. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I stood there, confronting not just the person I once loved, but also the painful truth that everything I believed in had been built on lies. The man behind her, who had been so casually dismissed in a phone call, was now a living symbol of the betrayal I'd endured. There, in the dim light of that shabby motel room, the facade of normalcy crumbled entirely. That moment marked a turning point. I knew that whatever came next, I could no longer live in the shadows of deceit. The confrontation was inevitable, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, but one thing was clear: I would no longer allow betrayal to define the next chapter of my life. The truth was out, recorded and undeniable, and I was ready to face the consequences, no matter how painful the journey might be. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I waited by the door, the evidence of her betrayal burning a hole in my pocket. When the door finally creaked open, Melanie's face turned ashen, her eyes widening in shock and guilt, and she could barely muster a word. The sight of her pale expression confirmed everything I had suspected. I didn't waste another moment. I pulled out my phone and played the video, the recording of her with that man in the motel room, filling the space between us with damning evidence. "Is this what you call honesty?" I asked, my voice low and trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. "Our daughter, Sophie, is in the hospital, fighting for her life because of you. Your selfish choices and lies have led us to this mess." For a long, painful moment, she stood there, eyes darting away as if searching for a way out. Her voice came out in a weak, stuttering attempt at excuses. "Alex, I can explain," she began, but the words faltered before they even reached my ears. Every excuse, every feeble attempt to rationalize her behavior only deepened the chasm between us. The more she tried to speak, the more I realized that no explanation could justify the betrayal and the neglect that had endangered our child. Without giving her a chance to continue, I turned on my heel and left, the echo of the door slamming behind me reverberating like a final verdict. I drove home in a haze of bitter anger and sorrow, my thoughts racing with the irreversible damage that had been done. The weight of the evidence and the gravity of her choices made it clear that there was no coming back from this. I had to act swiftly and decisively, for Sophie's sake and for my own sanity. The next day, as the first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, I made the decision that would change everything. With a heavy heart but resolute determination, I filed for divorce and immediately began the process of obtaining full custody of Sophie. It was a decision born out of the sheer necessity to protect her from any further harm. I couldn't and wouldn't allow her to be collateral damage in the wake of Melanie's reckless choices. In the days that followed, my phone became a relentless source of torment. Call after call came through, 30 a day at first, each one an unwelcome reminder of the shattered promises and the betrayal that had torn apart our family. I ignored them all, focusing instead on the legal proceedings and the recovery of our daughter. But as the calls persisted, they gradually escalated into something more menacing. The messages became laced with threats, each one carrying a chilling promise of retribution. "You'll regret this, Alex," one message read, the words dripping with venom. Another warned, "This isn't over. You'll pay for what you've done." Each call, each text, only reinforced the reality that Melanie's betrayal had unleashed forces far beyond my control. Yet, even as the threats piled up, I remained unyielding. My mind was made up. I wasn't going to be dragged into her web of deceit and manipulation any further. Every ring of my phone was met with silence on my end. I was determined to focus on what truly mattered, protecting Sophie and rebuilding a semblance of a safe, stable life for us both. In the midst of the legal battles and the barrage of hostile messages, I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions. There is anger, undoubtedly, but also a profound sadness over the loss of what I thought was a partnership built on love and trust. It was a bitter pill to swallow, to realize that the person you once believed in so completely could betray you in the most fundamental way imaginable. Yet in that darkness, there was also a glimmer of resolve. I had reached a turning point. I was done with the lies, done with the half-truths and the evasive justifications. I was taking control of my life, reclaiming the narrative that had been twisted by betrayal. The evidence was undeniable, the consequences irrevocable. And as I continued on this painful journey, I knew that every step I took was one step closer to ensuring that Sophie would never be left unprotected again. That day, as I watched the sunset from my apartment window, a solitary figure wrapped in the quiet determination of a man who had finally decided to stand up for what was right, I realized that I had reached the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. The path ahead was fraught with legal battles, emotional scars, and the lingering echoes of broken promises. But I was ready. For Sophie's sake, and for the shattered pieces of my own heart, I would confront whatever came next, head-on, with the unwavering belief that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. The next day, as I was trying to put together the shattered pieces of our lives, my phone lit up with an ominous call from an unknown number. I hesitated only a moment before answering, steeling myself for another twist in this relentless nightmare. Melanie's voice, cool and insincere as ever, came through, but this time it carried an edge, a threat wrapped in feigned concern. Before I could muster a response, she declared that she had called the police and social services, accusing me of neglect and claiming that I wasn't taking proper care of Sophie. I felt my pulse spike as the gravity of her words sank in. With all the chaos still swirling around us, now the institutions meant to protect children were being weaponized against me. I was determined not to let her manipulative tactics derail the truth. When the officials arrived at our home, I welcomed them into the living room with a calm exterior, though my heart was still pounding like a jackhammer. I knew that I had no choice but to face her baseless allegations head-on. With a steady voice, I explained the situation in detail and pulled out the official hospital reports I'd been given when I first rushed Sophie to the emergency room. The documents were clinical and damning evidence of the neglect that had nearly cost my daughter her life. Her dangerously high fever, critically low blood sugar, and severe dehydration were all recorded meticulously. I handed over the reports, making sure every page was in plain sight, letting the cold, factual words speak for themselves. The hospital's findings were undeniable. The social services officer, after a thorough review, looked up at me with a mixture of empathy and professional resolve. "These reports leave little doubt," she said. The police officer present nodded in agreement, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the implications of Melanie's claims. It was clear that her attempt to paint me as the negligent parent was not only baseless, but entirely implausible given the concrete evidence before us. In that moment, the weight of her deceit came crashing down around her. The very move she had hoped would discredit me was turning against her, adding another piece of evidence to the growing pile that would be used in court. I could see the shift in the atmosphere. What was meant to be a smear campaign was instead exposing her irresponsibility. The officers, who had initially been skeptical, now understood the situation in its true light. Melanie's call to the authorities had backfired, revealing her as the one who had abandoned her responsibilities when Sophie needed her most. As the police completed their notes, and the social services officer assured me that the case would be thoroughly investigated, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Vindication, because the truth was finally on my side. Sorrow, because the woman I once loved was now standing exposed for her neglect. The evidence I'd already secured, combined with these official reports, was a heavy indictment of her actions. Every document, every statement, was a step toward justice for our daughter. That day, as I watched the professionals leave, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we had come from the moment I first returned home to a silent, dark house. Melanie's calculated counterattack was meant to sow doubt and paint me as a negligent father, but instead, it was another damning testament to her own guilt. Her actions would no longer be hidden behind the facade of a carefree lifestyle or masked by excuses. In the eyes of the law, every irresponsible decision, every act of abandonment was now documented, Another brick in the wall of evidence that would eventually lead to her downfall in court. I put my phone down, the silence that followed a stark reminder of the ongoing battle that lay ahead. The evidence was irrefutable, and while I still grappled with the emotional wreckage of betrayal, I found solace in the fact that justice was on its way. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I sensed that I was not alone in this fight, that the truth, bolstered by the cold, hard facts of the hospital reports and the testimonies of the authorities, would pave the way for a safer future for Sophie. This confrontation with the system, forced upon me by Melanie's own hand, became yet another turning point. It was a moment that underscored the stark reality. When you try to manipulate the truth with lies, the very institutions meant to protect the innocent will stand up and expose you. As I gathered my thoughts and prepared for the legal battles ahead, I vowed that I would continue to fight for our daughter, no matter how many more storms had to be weathered. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, with the truth as my shield, I knew I wasn't fighting in vain. Sitting in the courtroom, every detail felt surreal, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. My lawyer sat beside me, calm and methodical, as he began presenting all the damning evidence. One by one, he introduced the video recordings, the medical reports from the hospital, and even the police report. The room fell into a heavy silence as the exhibits were laid out, each piece of evidence more irrefutable than the last. I could see the judge's eyes narrow as he scanned through the files, the weight of the truth sinking in. The testimony of the hospital staff, the detailed account of Sophie's condition, and the incontrovertible footage of Melanie's betrayal left no room for doubt. The prosecution argued not just a case of infidelity, but a stark pattern of negligence and abandonment that had put our daughter's life at risk. Every statement, every recorded moment, was a reminder of the chaos that had invaded our lives. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke, his voice measured and decisive. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented, it is clear that the safety and well-being of the child must be the paramount concern, he declared. Therefore, full custody of Sophie is granted to Alex Baker. A murmur of approval swept through the courtroom as I exhaled, a mix of relief and sorrow mingling in my chest. The judge continued, outlining the terms for Melanie. Melanie Baker shall be permitted to see her daughter only under the supervision of designated social workers, ensuring that the child's welfare is never compromised. His words echoed in the sterile room, marking an irrevocable turning point in our lives. As the gavel fell, I felt the crushing weight of betrayal lift slightly, replaced by a fragile hope for a new beginning. Melanie's face, once composed and defiant, now revealed a raw mix of humiliation and regret. With barely a word, she turned and left the courtroom, her departure a silent acknowledgement of her failures. I remained seated for a long moment, absorbing the gravity of the decision. The journey to this point had been paved with pain and shattered trust, but now I had a chance to rebuild, a chance to create a safe haven for my daughter. Later that day, as we left the courthouse, I clutched Sophie's hand tightly. The fresh air outside felt different, filled with the promise of a future free from lies and toxic relationships. In the midst of the chaos that had defined the past weeks, Sophie's innocent smile was a beacon of light. As we walked out into the world that now seemed a little brighter, she tugged at my hand and asked with unfiltered delight, "Dad, can I have pancakes?" I couldn't help but laugh at the simplicity of her request, a request that cut through the complexity of our recent trials. "Of course, even for $30, I replied with a playful tone, a hint of mischief softening the edges of the harsh reality we had endured. "But today is a holiday," I added, knowing that in her world, a holiday meant hope, a fresh start, and a break from the darkness that had once overshadowed our lives. In that moment, the courtroom, the legal battles, and the wounds of betrayal seemed to recede, replaced by the gentle promise of healing and renewal. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Scars, both seen and unseen, would take time to fade. Yet, with Sophie's hand in mine, I was ready to embrace the uncertain future with a newfound determination. The truth had set us free, and as we walked toward the promise of pancakes and a simple, joyful meal, I felt that despite everything, we had finally found our way back to a place where hope could flourish.